Welcome. It's great to see so many people here. I'm Mike Ross. I'm the chairman of the Voice for Israel, and we're extremely excited to have this event tonight and have you all here. Before we get started, I have a lot of housekeeping to take care of, a lot of good housekeeping. That is, thank yous to a lot of people who made tonight's event possible. So I'm going to read some names. This event could not have happened with our benefactors. They made without our benefactors. That's true. This event, or Voice for Israel itself, we depend on the donations of our friends, and I want to acknowledge them and thank them. And most of you are here, a few are not. Susan and Gary Berend, Eva Gelfand, Susan and Mark Goldhaber, Beth and Adam Goldstein, Robin and David Green, Susan and Laszlo Gross, Mary and Ralph Goot, Laura and Robert Gutman, Sharon and Ed Helprin, Marion and Stan Roboy, Pam and Bill Rosenberg, Beth Friedland and Bob Rosenthal, Orit and Gabby Zulach, and Arlene Isaacson and Mark Warner. Thank you very much. I also want to give special thanks to our event committee planners. The committee was chaired by Stan and his wife Marion Roboy and Bob and Laura Gutman. Also providing great help were Arlene Isaacson and her children Rachel and David Werner and her husband Mark Werner. Also Susan and Morty Berkowitz. I don't know where they're sitting. A special round. Orit and Gabby Zulik, who aren't here tonight, they're on their anniversary trip. Susan and Gary Berend, and of course, last but not least, my wife Elizabeth, who I couldn't have done this without. Thank you. So I wanted to take a moment. I know people aren't here to hear about Voice for Israel, but just to review what we are, because a lot of people don't know who we are. And we're a grassroots organization. We started about 7 years ago, and we've been very gratified over the last 7 years to play a very important role in the Jewish community as a home for those who love and support Israel. Our support is passionate, but always respectful, and we are delighted to discover that so many share our devotion to Israel. We've cooperated and partnered with local federations and congregations, but we're proud to maintain our own distinct identity. We feel we are a small cog in efforts which are going on around the world to support Israel in the face of many detractors, as you are all well aware of. We do our best here. The challenges that we face are mirrored across the world, as you all know, and as our speaker tonight, Rabbi Gordis, knows very well. I wanted to tell you about an exciting initiative that we're starting in the next few months or 6 months. We're going to partner with Stand With Us to bring in more programs and more speakers. Stand With Us is an organization that is really concentrated on the college, the campus battlefield, which you all know is a very treacherous one right now, where Jewish students, pro-Israel students, feel sometimes under attack. So Stand With Us wants to partner with local groups, and we can facilitate programs and also hopefully facilitate more activity on campus for them. So why did we do this tonight? We wanted to bring Rabbi Gordis here as an opportunity for us all to share our love and concern for Israel and to celebrate that. We feel it's essential that we remind ourselves that the cause of Israel is just, and the need for Israel, just not for the Jewish people, but for the world, is very important. I'm not going to specifically introduce Rabbi Gordis, but I am going to refer to him. His life's work and passion has been infused with his love for the Jewish people. He has dealt with the fundamental issues of how to build a homeland in which Jewish life, in all its wondrous fashion, thrives. But in doing so, it needs to maintain a society which lives up to the highest inherent values that it holds. He is one of the Jewish world's leading intellects dealing with just those issues. His voice, I think, is of paramount importance for us to hear. I know tonight he will both inform and inspire us. And before I introduce the person who's going to introduce Rabbi Gordis, I just want to remind people that afterwards there's going to be a book sale. Rabbi Gordis has just come out with a book, and it just was published a week ago, or came out. It's a great book, and I am not a salesman. I am the worst salesman, as my wife will tell you. I couldn't sell a bottle of water to a thirsty wanderer in the desert, but these books are really great, and I think they will make a great Hanukkah gift. And we're selling them through Quail Ridge, and they have a great program if anybody's interested, but 20% of the proceeds will go back to Voice for Israel. So that would be nice. Anyways, so afterwards there'll be dessert refreshments, and he'll be signing books. Now I'd like to introduce Rabbi Graber, as you know, is the executive rabbi, chief rabbi of Bethel Synagogue. They're laughing at me. He's a great friend. He's known Rabbi Gordis for a very long time, and he's going to introduce Rabbi Gordis. Rabbi Graber.
I just got a promotion. So I'm going to read a few parts of Rabbi Gordis' official biography. Dr. Daniel Gordis is Senior Vice President and the Koret Distinguished Fellow at the Shalem College in Jerusalem. He writes a regular column, A Dose of Nuance, for the Jerusalem Post, and is a regular contributor to the New York Times in print and online. The author of numerous books on Jewish thought and currents in Israel, and a winner of the National Jewish Book Award, Dr. Gordis was the founding dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at the University of Judaism, where the first rabbinical college on the west coast of the United States, and where I had the privilege to study with him for part of the time that I studied for ordination. Dr. Gordis joined Shalem in 2007 and has helped found Israel's first liberal arts college after spending 9 years as vice president of the Mandel Foundation in Israel and director of its Leadership Institute. You can read a lot more of his biography, which is quite extraordinary. And as was mentioned, he is the author of a new book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. I am part of the way through it, got my advance copy, and underlined a few sentences about the book. He says, this book tells the story of the idea of a Jewish state, where that notion originated, how it was preserved, and how the dream was transformed into reality. The why behind why and Israel. For me, the chance to introduce Rabbi Gordis is also a personal one. It was in the second year of rabbinical school that he was offered a fellowship at the Mandel Institute in Jerusalem. And when he asked my wife Jennifer and me to babysit for the kids while they went and looked for an apartment, the thought was that it would only last a year, but he ended up making Aliyah and wrote emails back to the rabbinical school about his experiences in Jerusalem and his experiences of being in Israel during very difficult times. And what Rabbi Gordis was doing in that moment was sharing with us the way in which a commitment to the Jewish tradition, a commitment to Judaism, cannot be separated from a commitment to the Jewish people and from the experience of being part of living and the founding of and the prospering that takes place in the state of Israel, perhaps the most important project in Jewish history for 2,000 years. That these things go together, and that means that it's complicated and it's difficult and it's beautiful and wonderful and all things in between. And it's been a wonderful privilege to stay in touch with him. He was here 5 years ago when I just arrived. It's wonderful to have him back. And I will just finish by saying that, when you live in tricky times and when you're trying to figure out what way forward, it's a special thing to reunite with your teacher and with a friend. So it is wonderful to have you here, Dr. Daniel Gordis.
Thank you, Executive Rabbi Graber. And thanks to all of you for the invitation to be here tonight. Really, truly a real thrill to come back to a community that's very warm, very engaged, very passionate. Really a great thrill, and I'm delighted and honored to be here once again. So I want to begin by thanking you for babysitting the kids all those years ago when we went to look for an apartment. And people often, when they introduce me, they say, "Oh, you made this, unbelievably, impassioned and principled move to leave this job in Los Angeles and move to Israel." And they go on and on and on and on. So since he alluded to it, I should probably come clean at the outset and explain to you exactly how it was that we ended up moving to Israel, and then we can actually get to the actual lecture. So we went for this sabbatical, which I actually really did think was a one-year sabbatical, and we had 3 kids. They were 12, 9, and 5, and we put them in school, and I had a fake project that I had convinced somebody to fund this, a sabbatical for. And but the truth of the matter is I just wanted to read books and be left alone. And so the kids all went off to school, and this is probably about November of our year there. And the kids are gone. The Israeli school day, by the way, this is not a joke, that ends at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which explains a lot about Israel. But in any event, so you have very little bit of time, and kids were all gone. My wife and I got right back in bed. This story does not get more interesting. And we're both reading away. And, I remember still what I was reading. And my wife says to me, I'm not going back, right? I was like, yeah, fine, whatever. The kid's coming back in 2.5 hours. Just be quiet. I want to finish this book. So, we read a few more pages, and then she goes, I'm not going back, right? I said, it's fine. I'm almost finished with this chapter. Just be quiet. And a few minutes later, she says, and I think if you go back, you're going to miss the kids. And that was when I put my book down and I looked and I said, okay, I think this woman may be actually serious about something. But the reality is I can actually take very little credit for the move. It's actually a great privilege to marry someone who has a vision for life, who doesn't simply lurch from decision to decision and, opportunity to opportunity, but kind of zooms out and says, what do you want to do with whatever number of years you're privileged to have on the planet? And she knows what she wants. I remember when we were juniors in college, we met the summer after freshman year. She was in college in Boston. I was in college in New York. She liked where she was. I liked where I was, but we also liked each other. So we decided that for our junior year, we'd go to the same city, and we'd see if there was a there. So I said, let's go to Oxford. She said, let's go to Jerusalem. So we compromised. We went to Jerusalem. And so she has been working me over to get me there for a very, very long time. And the way I pay her back is by going on the road and coming to places like this with people who don't tell me what to do and, take a little bit of a respite. But I want to thank Rabbi Graber really for the very warm introduction, to thank Mike and everybody else here for really extending the invitation, and to tell you what it is that I'd like to do tonight. I want us to try to figure out tonight how the conversation about Israel became poisoned. And that's really the bottom line. It doesn't matter whether you're right or left. You just know that nobody talks to Israel about it. And nobody talks to anybody about Israel. There's people that you won't talk to, or it becomes this strident exchange of positions in which everybody talks and nobody listens. Everybody yells and nobody learns. And there is really one of the very few areas in which we've just lost the ability to actually engage in serious conversation. Now, the truth of the matter is that we are actually adding to the list of subjects on which we can actually not engage in serious conversation. So I want to begin by thanking all of you, because usually it was the case that when I came to America, I was very self-conscious about our political system. But you've made us feel infinitely better, and I'm happy to talk to you about the Israeli political system now with tremendous pride and etc. But having said that, I really want to try to figure out why the conversation about Israel has become as complex and as vitriolic, and I would say really almost as poisoned as it really has become. And here's my thesis. My thesis is that it's become the way it's become because we have allowed the conversation about Israel to become focused almost exclusively on the conflict. The conflict is a very big issue. But very few people are dying in the conflict, by the way, right now, thank God. But we have allowed the conflict to take over almost, if not the entire Israel conversation, then most of the Israel conversation. And the way to think about that is to ask yourself about the last 10 conversations that you had about Israel with whomever, your children, your grandchildren, your colleagues, your spouse, your neighbors, your friends, whatever it was. And ask yourself, of those 10 conversations, how many of them were not about the occupation, Iran, tunnels, Hezbollah, Hamas, Obama good, Obama bad, Trump good, Trump bad, but all about something having to do with Israel and the people who surround Israel and want to do it in. My bet would be that of the last 10 conversations that you had about Israel, maybe all of them were about those things, and if it wasn't all of them, it was very close to all of them. And what we have therefore allowed to happen is that a conversation which really should be about why a country was created and what pulses at the heart of that country, and why the people who strove to create it did so, and why the people who give so much to perpetuate it do so, that conversation has become very much narrowed to how long is the occupation going to go on. I'm going to give you an analogy. Let's say someone asked us what it is that America's about. Let's say that they asked us that when we knew, okay? And we wanted to try to answer them, sort of what are the great ideas that are at the heart of this extraordinary republic? And we answered them in the following way. Well, there was a war in 1776, and we won that one. And then there was a war in 1812, and there was a civil war between 62 and 65. I'm going to skip a bunch of them. There was a First World War, there was a Second World War, there was a Korean War, there's a Vietnam War, there's a war in Iraq, there was a war in Afghanistan. Now you know what America's about. You know nothing about what America's about. Part of what America's about meant that it had to fight some of those wars. It had to save the Western world during the Second World War, among other things. But knowing about those wars says nothing really about the substance of what America is about, why it was created, and so forth. In order to understand that, you need to learn something very different. You need to read the Federalist Papers. You need to read the Declaration of Independence really carefully. Might be worth reading the very last public letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote about 2 weeks before he died, by the way, on July 4th, 50 years after the Republic was created. A letter in which he wrote to his colleagues who invited him to come back to D.C. and to celebrate half a century of American life, in which he responded that he was unable to do so because he was already very weak. But he then mused aloud about what it was that the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution had actually done, not for the colonies and not for Americans, but for the Western world at large and for the project of democracy across the globe. If you want to know what America's about, you got to read Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum Address. Not the Gettysburg Address, which is very powerful, but it doesn't really say very much about what America's about. The Lyceum Address about the rule of law, about slavery and so forth, says a tremendous amount. You probably got to read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail and be reminded, by the way, that Martin Luther King was in jail not in China and not in Korea. He was in jail in the United States, and we have the Birmingham letter because he wrote it in the margins of newspapers and smuggled a little piece of paper out with people who visited him because he wasn't allowed to write in the Birmingham jail. You need to read all those things and know all those stories and know much more to have a real appreciation of what it is that this extraordinary republic is really all about. And we don't have the parallel conversation about Israel. We don't have the parallel conversation about Israel's Federalist Papers, which are more or less the engaging conversation between Zionist thinkers in all of those years, let's say from 1897 with the first Zionist Congress, although some of it was before, until the founding of the state in 48. We very, very rarely read the Declaration of Independence and ask ourselves what it's about. We very rarely read some of the foundational documents, Supreme Court rulings, and so on and so forth, in which the pulse of the state comes to the surface. And therefore we create a vacuum. And as you all know, nature abhors a vacuum. And if you create a vacuum of ideas, the only thing that's going to seep in is what you get on these little machines. And what you get on these little machines, especially with social media, is the lowest possible common denominator, which in the case of Israel is the conflict. And when you and I look at young American Jews and we are pulling our hair out about where most young American Jews are on Israel, how disassociated they feel, how hostile they often are, I want to tell you something. It's our fault. Because we didn't give them anything else. I'm going to talk about the book in a second, but it's the first book to be written that's a one-volume history of the state of Israel by an American in 40 years. Howard Sacker, who's a much better scholar than I am by like 1,000 gazillion times, wrote that book in 1976. Now, it got updated periodically, obviously, but the tone was set in 1976. The world's changed enormously since 1976, and by the way, the book is 1,200 pages long. A generation that thinks in 140 characters does, they call it thinking, but a generation that at least writes or tweets in 140 characters does not read 1,200 pages. And the next major one that came out was Sir Martin Gilbert's, which came out in 98, which runs about 700-something pages, and is written by a Brit. And it's a fantastic book. It's a book of great scholarship, but the British ear and the American ear are different ears, and the questions are different questions, and the sensitivities are different sensitivities, and life marched on. And then now, a couple of years ago, came Anita Shapira's book. Anita Shapira is one of Israel's leading historians. She's a phenomenal scholar. Her book runs about almost twice as long as this one, and she's Israeli. And again, it's a fantastic book, but it's not a fun read in the sense that there's just much too much detail in there. The national water carrier extends 27 miles due south, then it turns southwest for another 15. I mean, really, who cares? Just tell me there's a national water carrier. Because to get to people to read a book now, it's got to be the kind of book that literally you can actually pick up on a Thursday of Thanksgiving weekend, leave some time for some college football, and still by the end of Sunday say, I read the book, I get the story, and I know now not only what happened, but I've begun to understand why it happened. What was the cause of all this? And this was exactly the purpose of trying to write the book. To recognize that we as American Jews have actually created a vacuum by not talking about why a Jewish state, and into that vacuum has seeped only one subject, a painful subject, a grinding subject, a corrosive subject, which if that's the only thing that you know about Israel is the conflict, it's a subject that leaves little space at all for any sense of awe, any sense of the supernatural, any sense of a kind of a great profound gratitude, and then we find ourselves where we are. So what I wanted to try to do in this book was to ask a very simple question. Why did the Jews create a state? Not because of the Holocaust. They started the work in 1897. What were we trying to do? Were we trying to break away from the crown and not have taxation without representation? What were we trying to do? And the reality is that most of us actually can't answer that question. Jews were coming much more to America than they were to Palestine then, and as you know, Jews who came to America did fairly well. So they weren't looking for a place where they could go and not be oppressed, because that place was called right here. And they weren't looking for a place where they could go and eke their way out of poverty, because that place was right here. And they weren't looking for a place to go where they could finally have religious liberty, because that place was right here. So what were they trying to do? And unless we can answer that question, we can't begin to explain what the state of Israel is, why the state of Israel was created, what its flourishing would look like, and then deal with some of the ways in which it has not always lived up to our grandest expectations, in just the very same way that America has not lived up to our grandest expectations, in the way that our children don't always live up to our grandest expectations, and so on and so forth. So what were we really trying to do there? That's really the big question. Somebody needs to wake up. It's time to get up. And where I live, actually, it's only 3 in the morning. It's a little early to wake up. But it is 1 hour before the hour that we woke up to watch the debates and 2 hours before the hour that we woke up to watch the results. But we're not going to go there tonight. But in any event, what were the Jews trying to do? So I start the book with Chaim Nachman Bialik, the poet laureate, first of the Zionist movement and then of the Jewish state, who in 1882, at the grand old age of 19, writes a poem which makes him an international figure almost overnight, which is pretty amazing, by the way, since technology did not allow for poems to actually make the way across the globe all that quickly. He writes a poem that in the space of a very short while transforms him into an internationally known figure at the age of 19. The poem's called To the Bird. And as some of you know, it begins, Shalom Rav Shuvech Tzipor Nechmedet Me'artzot HaChom El Chaloni. Hello, you lovely bird who has come back from the warm climes of the East, i.e. the Middle East, to my window here in Eastern Europe. And the young man turns to the bird and he asks questions about the land of Israel, which Bialik had never seen at that point. And he says, does dew still fall on the Hermon like pearls? Does God have mercy on Zion? Both of those being quotes from the Bible. He'd never seen Palestine, but he knew Palestine. He knew its hills, and he knew its valleys, and he knew its weather, and he knew its seasons, because he knew the Bible inside and out. And then he asks the bird, over there where you come from, do calamities happen to us like they happen here? And it was the ability of a young man at the age of 19 to express the utter heartbreak of the Jewish people that transformed him into an international sensation. And Zev Jabotinsky, who would then eventually become the leader of revisionist Zionism, would later say that Bialik had the single greatest ability of anyone in the world to give expression to the soul of the Jewish people. By 1903, though, the Jewish world has changed. From 1882, there's been a first Zionist Congress in 1897, political Zionism is launched, and the 20th century has dawned. And the 20th century was supposed to be a century of reason, of science, of leaving behind all the ridiculous hatreds and competitiveness and murderousness of the 19th century. And for Jews, the 20th century opens up in Kishinev with a pogrom, which shocked the Jewish world, not because pogroms were unknown, and not because it was the worst pogrom that there ever was, but because it happened in the 20th century. This was supposed to be the century, they said, in which that didn't happen. Little did they know where the 20th century was going. And the Jewish Historical Society of Odessa, where Chaim Nachman Bialik was then living in 1904, sent Bialik to Kishinev to go find out what happened. And they sent not a historian, but a poet. So they got not a report, but a poem. They got a very, 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 very long poem that, depending on the edition that you read, you know how the printing is, goes on for 20 pages, 30 pages. I mean, it's a very long poem. And it's called Be'ir HaHarega, in the city of slaughter. And it's the images and impressions of the poet as he is taken around the city. Here's what happened here. Here's what happened there. And at a certain point, the person leading him around says, come to the cellar. Come to the cellar of this particular building. This is the room in which the women of Kishinev were attacked and violated. The daughters in the presence of their mothers, and the mothers in the presence of their daughters. Time and time and time again. And then Bialik says, while the attack is going on in this cellar, there are also Jewish men. And they are hiding behind a slatted wooden wall right off to the side. Says Bialik, looking through the slats and seeing what's happening and speaking to God and saying, please God, save my soul this day. And at that moment in the poem, Bialik calls them Bnei HaMaccabim, the descendants of the Maccabees. which is a name dripping with irony and with derision, which is to say that the Maccabees got rid of the Greek Empire, and you guys can't beat away a band of thugs? What happened to you? And then Bialik describes that when the attack is over and the Cossacks leave, the men step out from behind the wall. They look down at the bodies, still living, obviously, of their women, their wives, their daughters, their mothers, their sisters, whatever. They step over the bodies of the women and run to the local rabbi to ask, "Tell me, Rabbi, is my wife still permitted to me?" Now, it didn't happen. It's literature. It's like watching a Shakespearean play and asking, is that true? It's entirely the wrong question. Great literature is about shining a spotlight, like an X-ray almost, on the human condition. And what's Bialik saying, not about the human condition, but about the Jewish condition? First of all, he says, you're weak. There had been an era in which Jews kicked the Greeks out of the land of Israel. And you can't fight off a band of thugs. But much worse than being weak is being a coward. And you are cowards. Because you could have died trying to save them, and that would have been more honorable. But you hid there, quaking in your boots, waiting for it to be over. And then Bialik says, worst of all, you look at them on the ground, and all they need is for you to kneel beside them and hold them and tell them that it'll be okay, even though it won't, and tell them that you love them, which you should, and you step over them and you run to the rabbi. And he says, when you see a broken human being like that, and all you see is a halachic question, a question of Jewish law, says Bialik, you're not even human anymore. Eastern Europe and traditional Judaism have so eviscerated you that you are weak, you're cowardly, and you're not human. And that poem, written in 1904, is effectively the Zionist movement's declaration of war on the Jewish tradition. It is the Zionist tradition's claim that what we are about is not creating a state. We're about reinventing the Jewish people. Zionism is about we're going to change what it means to be a Jew, and we're going to get the men out from behind the slatted walls where they quake in their boots and pray to God that somebody will save them, but nobody takes care of their mothers and their sisters and their wives and their daughters. What Zionism was about and what the Jewish state was about the Jewish people reimagining itself. Was about the Jewish people saying to itself, we want something different than what we have. Not only physical security, and not only financial stability, and not only religious liberty, we want a place where we can reimagine what it ought to be a Jew. That's what Zionism was about. And Zionism, at that point in the early part of the 20th century, becomes an unbelievably vitriolic but fascinating conversation between socialist Zionists and free market Zionists. Between Zionists who say, yeah, we want a homeland, but we have to wait for God to bring us to it. And Zionists say, we've been waiting for God for a really long time. It's not working out really well. Let's just do it now. Between Zionists who said that the state should be fundamentally secular and international and universalistic, and those who said it ought to be profoundly Jewish and particularistic. Between those who said the Arabs in the area, Herzl said this, are going to so love us because we're going to bring progress to the Middle East that there's not going to be a problem. They're going to embrace us. And there were those like Jabotinsky who said, if you believe that, you're a racist. Because you don't take their love of their land with the same seriousness that you take your love of that land. They love that land the way that we love that land. And if you think they're just going to give it up because you bring plumbing to Palestine, you've lost your mind. And that's the battle between the Labor Party and the Likud Party to this very day. The battle between religious and secular, between free market and socialist, between all different kinds of things, including the attitude to the people who surround us, are really just continuations of a profound conversation that begins really at the beginning of the 20th century and continues into the 30s and 40s. What kind of new Jew are we creating? And you can see, by the way, in those early posters that we've all seen, that were produced by the early Zionist movement in the 1910s and the 20s and the 30s, with these very angular people standing out there. You know, they're bronzed and they're muscular and they're in the field. Not those little Rembrandt pictures of the man with the beard huddled over with a candle in the corner over a page of Talmud. The Zionists wanted none of that. So they produced posters of what they were trying to create. The men and the women who, by the way, seriously, by the way, looked almost indistinguishable. All of them very brawn and bronzed, holding a rifle in one hand and a pitchfork in the other, which by the meant you couldn't really use either, but that's a technicality. It was Zionism's way of saying, no, we're getting out of the yeshiva. We're walking out of the dark, dank, damp yeshiva where we've been huddled over Talmud for thousands of years, waiting for them to slaughter us. And we're going to create a new reality in which no one's going to tell us where we can live when. Because in 1290, when England decided that it didn't want any Jews, the Jews were gone. And in 1492, when Spain decided it didn't want the Jews were gone. And by the way, the Jews were gone doesn't mean you got on an airplane and you went to a new neighborhood. It meant that you left everything that you had behind. And you moved to a country where nobody knew you, where nobody wanted you, where you didn't speak the language, where you had zero assets, where an entire Jewish community was turned into poverty overnight. And Zionists were about saying in part, those days are over. We are not going to live in a place where we nervously look at the newspapers to ask ourselves, are they getting tired of us once again? Done. Finished. And part of the problem that you and I face with the younger Jewish American generation today is that Zionism was so unbelievably successful, and it was so successful so quickly, that we've actually forgotten to teach our kids what it really is, which is that it is the liberation movement of the Jewish people. That is what Zionism is. Zionism was not the desire to create a state in Palestine. Zionism was not the quest for a place in which we could sing Hatikvah. Zionism was not a place where Jews could turn into soldiers. Zionism was the liberation movement of the Jewish people. It's become so successful that we forget that it's a liberation movement because most liberation movements, also almost by definition, are not yet successful. Ours has been successful. I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. It was wildly successful, and it was wildly successful very quickly. Herzl goes back to his room in Basel in the summer of 1897 after the first day of the First Zionist Congress. And he writes in his diary, "Today I created the Jewish state." And he's smart enough to know, even though his intersections with reality were haphazard at best, he's smart enough to know, he says, if I were to say that out loud, people would laugh at me. But it's true. 5 years, 10 years, no more than 50 years, and the Jewish state will exist. That's 1897. Add 50, you get 1947. You get the UN vote. It was unbelievably prescient, and it was unbelievably fast. It was also unbelievably successful. Most of us in this room are old enough to know that 22 years is nothing. 22 years is just like that. I want to tell you something about 22 years. In January 1945, the Allies liberate Auschwitz. And we have all seen the photographs of what spilled out of those gates. Skeletons, not yet dead, wearing ridiculously oversized clothes with stripes on them. People who, many of whom will die in the next few days simply because someone fed them. It is the utter picture of powerlessness, of victimization, of having been abandoned by the world. It's January 45. 22 years later, Israeli paratroopers break through the walls of the old city and unify Jerusalem, take the Sinai Peninsula, take the West Bank, take the Golan, and take Gaza, and in 6 lightning days, triple the size of the Jewish state. 22 years. completely changes the existential condition of the Jewish people. The realization of Zionism's dream was not in the UN vote of November 29th, 1947. That was a step. The realization of Zionism's dream was also, by the way, not May 14th, 1948, because the war broke out before that and continued more intensively after that, that it was never clear that Israel was going to win it. 1% of the civilian Jewish population of the state of Israel died in the War of Independence. That'd be 3.6 million Americans. 1% is a lot of people. The country was devastated by that war. 56, a little bit better, but ended up giving the Sinai back right away because of the American administration. The first time the Jews actually took a deep breath and said, we're okay, is June 1967. And yes, it is true, and we'll come back to this, that June 1967 is also the beginning of what we now call the occupation. That's true. And it is true that the occupation is morally complicated and internationally, diplomatically very, very, very problematic. But what were you supposed to do in June 1967? Now, by the way, there were Israelis who said, give it back. Right then and there, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who was one of Israel's leading public intellectuals, an Orthodox guy, said, give it back right away, just hand it over. Because if you keep all those people under your thumb, you're going to corrode your soul. David Ben-Gurion, who was no longer prime minister, but who was as sharp and clear-headed in 67 as he ever was, said, keep Jerusalem because it's the eternal capital of the Jewish people, keep the Golan because it's about the safety of the north, and give the rest of it back right now. Now, in retrospect, do Yeshayahu Leibovitz and David Ben-Gurion look very prescient? Of course they do. But can one understand why a people that for thousands of years had never been able to breathe deeply and say, we're finally okay, when the Arabs go to Khartoum a few weeks after the war and come back and say, no peace, no recognition, no negotiations, can you understand why people wouldn't just give it back? You can understand that. You can't in 1967 look ahead and see 2016. So yes, it is true that 1967 begins to complicate things in ways that Israelis back then had no way of knowing what happened. But part of the story of 1967 also is that it's the proof that Zionism was ultimately successful in changing the existential condition of the Jew. That had always been the purpose of Zionism, as we said before. If you wanted to serve in an upper echelon of David Ben-Gurion's government, you had to change your last name. You had to get rid of your European last name. David Gruen became David Ben-Gurion. Simon Persky became Shimon Peres. Arik Scheinerman became Arik Sharon. Golda Meyerson became Golda Meir. And it wasn't that you just had to have a cute little Israeli name so you could wear a kova tembel and pick Jaffa oranges. You had to have a new name because you had to have a new soul. You couldn't be a European Jew anymore. It was about wiping out that Europeanness in you. It was about creating a new Jew altogether. So by 1967, before 1967, if somebody had said to you, what's the photograph that most represents the existential condition of the Jewish people? Everyone would point to that little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands in the air and the German pointing the gun at him, etc., etc. But by July and August and September of 1967, if anybody asked you that question, it's 3 paratroopers standing in front of the wall, not in a religious picture. They are not having their heads covered. They are not facing the kotel. They're facing away from the wall. It's not a religious picture. It's a picture of confidence. It's a picture of being at home. It's a picture of being not alone anymore. It's a picture of the success of Zionism. Part of what a young generation today doesn't understand, Jews, non-Jews alike, is that not that long ago, and in the lifetimes of many of the people in this room right now, there were boats filled with Jews sailing the seas that had nowhere to go. The St. Louis left Germany with about 900 people on board, every single one of whom had bought a completely legal visa to Cuba. The boat got to Cuba. The Cubans weren't interested. So the boat headed north. It was within 90 nautical miles of the United States of America. And the Roosevelt administration did not want Jews. So the boat was turned away. And I'll spare you the long and drawn-out story, but the boat eventually went back to Germany, where about 25% of the people on the boat were killed in gas chambers and went up crematoria. The Struma set sail with about 700 Jews from Romania down through the Black Sea, the Bosphorus, supposed to go to the Mediterranean. Outside Istanbul, it breaks down. It's hauled into the Istanbul harbor. Turks don't want Jews. 700 people, 8 toilets, 3 months. Turks won't give them food. The Jewish community of Istanbul provides the food. Nobody will take them. The Turks don't want them, as I said. The British don't want them. The United States calls the British and said, what are you talking about? Come on, one boatload of Jews. The British say St. Louis. Eventually, the Turks say, we got to get this boat out of here. This boat's taking up space in our harbor. And they tow it up to the Black Sea, where a Soviet submarine, which has been warned not to let anything move from south to north because goods could be coming to German supporters, fires one torpedo at the boat, sinks the whole thing, one person survives. David Stoliar, he died in Oregon about 2 years ago. There were boats sailing the seas that literally had nowhere to go. There were Jews who couldn't find a place on the planet to put their feet down. And Zionism said, no more. And the fact of the matter is that the fact that young people today can't even imagine a world like that is testimony to the unbelievable success of Zionism. So it's horrifying that in the year 2016, Jews are fleeing Europe again. It's really unbelievable that in 2016, Jews are fleeing Europe again. And the French are coming to Israel by the thousands, many of them to our neighborhood, actually, because our neighborhood is a relatively immigrant-filled neighborhood. So 3 or 4 years ago, if you had taken a walk on Shabbat on the train tracks, which the British laid in 1931, and which we've now turned into a bike path and a walking path and all of that kind of stuff, you would hear a few years ago, you'd hear some Hebrew, you'd hear a lot of Arabic, because the path goes through Beit Safafa, which is an Arab village, which has now been kind of encapsulated by Jerusalem. You'd hear some English, you hear a little bit of Russian. Nowadays, you hear all of those things, and you hear mostly French. Now, it's not all bad. The bakeries have gotten unbelievably good. But when I hear the French, my heart breaks. I mean, it's fantastic for Israel. They're amazing people. The kids are serious students. They're just wonderful people. But they're there because they're fleeing Europe again. I just hear the French and I want to cry. But young people here don't even get how dramatically successful Zionism has been, because it's transformed the world so completely that they can't even remember it at all. What you and I need to do is to remind ourselves and our friends and our colleagues and our neighbors and our children and our grandchildren and their friends and so on and so forth, that at its root core, what Zionism is more than anything else is the liberation movement of the Jewish people. And it's been unbelievably successful. But when we understand Zionism as the liberation movement of the Jewish people, then what we can begin to do is to understand that there are natural alliances to be made. There's a natural alliance to be made with a version of Black Lives Matter that is not hostile to Israel, because we're about the same thing. Our kids on college campuses would understand that many of those other progressive movements that are so appealing to them are not in tension with Zionism, but are actually parallels to Zionism, because they are about greater liberty, they are about greater dignity, they are about greater freedom. And the reason they can't understand any of that, of course, is because we talk about the occupation, and we talk about the occupation exclusively. I want to say something about the occupation, because not to talk about the occupation in a conversation like this is to avoid the elephant in the room, and I don't think that's intellectually honest. The occupation is going to be with us for a very long time. For a very, 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 very long time. And I will go out on a limb and say that there's not a single person in this room who's going to live to see the end of it. And I wish that were not the case. Every time I vote in Israel, I vote for a person that I think has the best chance, among other things, of putting an end to it. But let's just understand the reality, which again, our own grandchildren who are busy being angry at the Jewish state just don't know. At the first time somebody suggested splitting up that land because there were two peoples who laid claim to it was in 1936 with the Peel Commission. What the Peel Commission offered the Jews was a small fraction of what the Jews thought they were getting, and they were enraged. And they said yes. And the Arabs said no. In November 1949, the United Nations voted to give the Jews a state, which was more or less balanced, almost balanced demographically between Jews and Arabs, and to give the Arabs a state which was overwhelmingly Arab and had almost no Jews in it. Meaning if the Arabs had just said yes and waited a little bit, they'd have had both. The Jews were, again, very unhappy about the breakup, and they said yes. And the Arabs said no and began a war. And 5 armies, including Iraq, which doesn't even share a border with Israel, attacked. Then there was a war in 56, and there was a war in 67, which we already talked about. And now, today, the world says, go back to the 67 lines. Go back to the 67 lines as if, by the way, that will make everything okay. Let me just ask you this. If it's really about the 67 lines and nothing else, why 2 weeks ago in Ramallah did they name a major square after the mastermind of the Munich Olympic massacre? How does that move statehood forward? How does it move statehood forward if in the Palestinian Authority you post something about Mahmoud Abbas, you go to jail? One Facebook posting, boom, you're in jail. How does it help statehood if we don't answer the following question? We want to go back to the 67 lines, because what Israel captured in the 67 war, you can't capture stuff in war and keep it. That's not okay. Well, what about all the stuff that was captured in the War of Independence? What about, like, the Galilee? What about, like, half the Negev? Why do we get to keep that? Why do you get to keep what you captured in the War of Independence, but you don't get to keep what you captured in the 67 war? Put it differently. If you go back to the 67 line, why would they not then say we want the 49 line? Why would they not say that? That's the natural thing to say. Do we have any guarantees that that's not going to happen? Do we know, of course, that those 1949 lines are simply 100% militarily indefensible? And, by the way, that territory that would remain is literally now not big enough for the 6 million Jews, which is a crazy number, but the 6 million Jews who now live in the state of Israel? Do we know, if we pull back to the 1967 lines, that the cities around the line do not become sderot? That's what I want to know from the typical college kid when I go to a campus. End the occupation now, pull back to 67. So I say to her, okay, I'm actually game. But I just want to know, how do you know they're not going to shell my house the next day? And my granddaughter visits there. I mean, forget my kids, right? My granddaughter visits there. Do you have an answer to that? Do you have an answer for what I'm going to do when the shelling starts? Do you think the world's going to be okay with our sending tanks back in and taking it back? Or should we just let the eastern border turn into what the western border is? And if you don't have an answer to that question, it is immoral to ask Israel to move back. It's immoral to put millions of people within rocket range with no explanation for what you're going to do to keep them safe. So that we not be said that we avoided the elephant in the room, I personally, people disagree with me, but I personally would like not to have an occupation. I would like personally to have sent my children to the army. Thank God they're all out by now. But I would have liked to have sent them to the army and not have them be part of an apparatus which controls 2.5 million people on the West Bank. I would rather that that was not the case. And I would give up a tremendous amount of land and even some security if I thought it would end the conflict. But I don't think anybody has any evidence at all that it would end the conflict, and most Israelis don't think it would end the conflict. And therefore, the moralizing, whether it's coming from the State Department or the White House or from college campuses in America about let us show you natives how to do it, falls on very deaf ears. Because you live between 2 oceans and Canada and Mexico. It's just not the same thing. So the people who want not to move out of the occupation right now don't want to move out because they like occupying Palestinians. They just happen to like being alive. And that's part of the conversation that we also have to have. But I want to go back to where we started, and then we'll conclude and open it up. The bottom line at the end of the day is, though, that I think the occupation conversation is critically important, and we ought to have it. We ought to have it openly and honestly, but it cannot be that which takes up all of the airspace. Fundamentally, the conversation about the Jewish state has to be about the Zionist dream of transforming the Jewish people, of reimagining what it meant to be a Jew. of changing the existential condition of the Jew completely. And it's been so successful. Not only has it been so successful that young people in this country can't imagine a world with boats that have nowhere to go, can't imagine a world in which Jews feel that their lives are contingent. They just can't imagine the world in which Chaim Nachman Bialik spoke to the bird in utter heartbreak. Because the world of Jewish heartbreak seems like it was millennia ago, but it wasn't. Zionism has even been too successful. Because in that declaration of war in Be'er HaHaregah, when in that poem Bialik said, this religious tradition is turning you into something revolting. So David Ben-Gurion on May 14th, 1948 stands up under that enormous poster of portrait of Theodor Herzl with his head uncovered as he declares the Jewish state. And for a very long time, the whole ethos of the secular kibbutz was, we want nothing to do with any of that stuff. And then in the last government, not this one, but the last Knesset, when Yair Lapid did very, very well, and in Israeli tradition, every new member of the Knesset gets up in front of the plenum and gives a little speech to the members of the Knesset. Ruth Calderon, a woman who's now about 60 years old, who grew up completely secularly, walks to the podium with a volume of Talmud in her hand, turns to her left to the Speaker of the Knesset, who's a religious man wearing a kippah, and says, I'm paraphrasing, but Mr. Speaker, I come to the plenum holding the love of my life. Those are the words that she used. Now, she was married. Unfortunately, her husband has passed away since then. But she's holding a Talmud, and she says, I'm holding the love of my life. She's saying, that part of the revolution we don't want anymore. We're actually still in the business of reimagining the Jew. And we really are. We're still trying to figure out what should be Jewish about this Jewish state, and how Jewish should the Jewish state be, and how should the Jewish state be Jewish. We need to read Bialik. We need to read Amos Oz. And we need to read David Grossman, and we need to read a book called Neuland, which of course is a play on the title of Alt Neuland of Herzl, written by a guy named Eshkol Nevo. Eshkol is a very strange first name unless you're the Prime Minister's grandson and your mother names you for her father. Eshkol Nevo is Levi Eshkol's grandson. He wrote a book not that long ago called Neuland. And it's a novel, it's just a novel, but it's about the question of why do these Israeli kids get out of the army and go to Nepal? Every single one of them, like it's part of the draft. But seriously, why do they do that? My kid just got back. Why do you, after 8 years in the army, wouldn't you think that he would just want a warm bed and to wake up to a home-cooked meal? No, he went off with a guy from his unit, and they slept in caves in Nepal for weeks on end. What's that about? What are these kids fleeing? What are these kids fleeing? It's about a lot of different kinds of things. We have to understand the Israeli soul. We got to get inside it. We got to read the literature. Got to watch the TV. One of Israel's top-rated TV shows is called Shtisel, which is the name of a Haredi family. It's a Haredi, it's a soap opera somewhere on the food chain between As the World Turns and The Good Wife. That's a pretty big expanse, but it's in there somewhere. And it's about a Haredi family. It's a very sympathetic view of a Haredi family, good marriages and bad marriages, and happy kids and unhappy kids, and Haredim who have complete religious faith, and Haredim who have great doubt. They're very sympathetic characters, most of them. And it's one of Israel's most popular shows. Now, how do you explain a show about Haredim becoming the most popular TV show in Israel when Haredim don't have televisions? They're not watching it. And how do you explain the fact, therefore, that secular Israelis have turned the show about Haredim, even though they're angry at the Haredim for not serving in the army and they're worried about the Haredi impact on the economy, that show has become a big hit because Israelis are wondering, what's the magic? I don't like their politics. I don't like their attitudes to women. I don't like a lot of things. But there's a magic. They're expanding at a rapid rate. Their kids mostly stay in the fold. They seem very content. Where's the magic? One of Israel's great intellectuals today is not Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who's passed away, but Micha Goodman. Micha Goodman has written 3 books. Every single one of them has been #1 on the bestseller list. He wrote a book about Maimonides, wrote a book about Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari, and he wrote a book about the book of Deuteronomy. Every single one of them became a national bestseller. The Haredim didn't buy it. They don't buy those books. Those books became bestsellers because Israelis ripped them off the shelves and ran home with them. There is a tremendous thirst in the Jewish state to re-embrace the Jewish tradition. And I end by telling you that only because it's a way of saying that the Zionist revolution was an enormously successful revolution, but it's also an ongoing revolution. We're still trying to figure out how we should be Jewish and who should be Jewish and what it should mean to have a Jewish state. We don't know that yet. There are 1,000 policy questions and a lot of moral questions that we haven't figured out, but that's what makes the state the vibrant, fascinating, compelling experiment that it is. And all I would say to those people out there who want nothing to do with us because the situation in the West Bank upsets them the way it upsets me, is that I'm not going to describe what America is by talking only about its wars. And I'm not going to tell you what my kids are like by only pointing to the things about them that I still wish would change. Because I know that being a patriot is to both love your country and to be willing to accept its flaws. And I know that being a parent is about being aware of your kid's flaws, but fundamentally loving your kid. And that's where we have to get a young generation of American Jews to come back to. And I really do believe if we tell the story differently, if we tell the story as a story of heartbreak, yearning for security, of a people yearning to go to a land that was once theirs and can be theirs again, reinventing themselves and reimagining themselves and continuing to reimagine themselves, we can transform Israel from the pariah that unfortunately many young people think it is, to the source of inspiration, hope, and accomplishment that I think we all know that it is. And when you ask, what's the mark of success of a book? I think, the publisher would say if 1 out of every 3 people in India buys the book, it'll be successful. That's not that's fine, but that's not what it's about. For me, if in 10 years, 5 years, whatever it is, we can point to a slight shift in the moving of the needle in the conversation about Israel. If we have expanded the conversation about Israel to be not only what, but why, and who, and for what purpose, and for what transformation. If that conversation has moved even a little bit in the direction of what I've tried to describe to you tonight, then the effort that went into the book will have been very much worth it. And for the opportunity to share with you the thoughts that lie behind the book and where I think we need to take the Israel conversation, I'm very, very grateful. Thanks very, very much. Thank you, Ben.
How long do you want to take Q&A?
Whatever you want.
We wanted to open, first of all, that was an amazing address, inspiring. It was incredible, gave us all so much to think about. I wish everybody could hear that. In fact, we hope that it was taped tonight. I wanted to open it up for Q&A for a short time. If people have any questions, there are a couple mics.
I think I might do it without the mics also.
Well, okay, if you speak loud enough.
And I'll also repeat the question.
I'll point the finger. You in the back there?
Yeah, because I can't help myself, I'm a college professor, I'll just remind you that a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end. Those are 2 parts. A sentence with a question mark at the end.
I'll start by thanking you for a great address. Thank you very much. Rabbi Gordis, you mentioned that the dialogue around Israel has deteriorated, centering around the conflict, and that you believe that the occupation will continue for the long term. How do we help the other side, as well as our side, to try to not center the future dialogue around the conflict if the occupation, as you say, is likely to continue for a long time?
Right, the reason I think the occupation has continued for a long time, I should have made it more clear than I did, and that was a mistake, is because I don't think that there's any indication that the other side wants to make any kind of compromise. I think that when you're actually still naming squares after people who massacred Jews in Germany, and you're still naming roads after people who are suicide bombers, and you, by the way, Abbas took enormous heat for going to Peres's funeral. Enormous heat for going to a funeral that was like 15, 20 miles away from home. When you're going to a funeral becomes an act of, being a Benedict Arnold in a certain way, that's a society that's a very, very long ways away from making a kind of an accommodation which says they also have a right to be here. My colleague at Shalem College, Dan Polisar, you can Google this later. Google has come to America? Yeah? Okay. Anyway, you can Google this later. It's an article in Mosaic magazine called What Do the Palestinians Want? And it's a summary, it's a kind of a survey of 300 Palestinian polls done by Palestinians of Palestinians. okay, which showed that about 20 years ago, when asked, how many of you think that the Jews have a right to some land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River? Approximately 60% of Palestinians about 20 years ago said that the Jews had no right to anything. When the same poll, more or less, was done about a year and a half ago, the number had gone to 80%. Now again, polls can be wrong, right? This just in, okay? So I don't want to say that just because that's what the polls say, people say one thing to pollsters and one thing to whatever. I get that, but the indications aren't positive. So the first thing that I should have just clarified is that when I say that, it's because I just don't think there's any indication that it's moving in the right direction. What can we do? That's a fantastic question, and I think the West doesn't know the answer to that question. Because look at our experiment with trying to bring democracy to almost any part of the Arab world. It's been a failure. The Arab Spring is the Arab winter. There's nothing spring-like about the Arab Spring. And I say that not gloating, and I say that not happily, and I say that not, God forbid, in any kind of racist way. I just say that something has gone awry in that part of the world, and the rejection of the West, and the rejection of modernity, and the rejection of democracy. I remind you, by the way, that Abbas, the great democratic leader of the Palestinian people with whom we're supposed to make a deal, is in the 10th year of a 4-year term. You know, you really should use these things instead of reminder, leave office, you know. But I guess he forgot to set a reminder, or Siri wasn't working that day, or whatever the case may be. So I think, so the question of what we can do to move it forward is really not very clear. Here's what I will say, though. Palestinians understand one, they're very smart. They're very, very smart. And they understand that time is on their side. Time is on their side. Look at the international community. Look at Israel's standing in the international community. Look in 2014, when admittedly only for, 36 hours or whatever, a president of the United States signs a line and no American airplanes can fly to Israel. What if it had gone on for a month? And what if the European airlines had joined in that? And what if, in addition to saying American airplanes can't come to Israel and European airplanes won't, Israeli airplanes can't go to there either? Then we're stuck. The Palestinians see that every time we're getting a little bit closer. And if you want to change the direction, it seems to me, the Palestinians have to understand that time is not on their side. So let's take one example, and then I'll go on to the next question. Building settlements, good idea, bad idea. I make for you either case, right? Bad idea because it's a waste of money, because we're eventually, hopefully, one day going to have to take at least most of them down, especially the ones that are out in the, sort of forlorn areas. Bad idea because it really annoys the Palestinians. Bad idea because, at least until recently, it's annoyed the White House and the State Department very, very, very much. And it lowers Israel's stock in the international community. So what the hell are you doing? Now I'll make the opposite case. You stop building settlements now without them having given you an inch. They understand. They don't have to budge, and international pressure on Israel will keep moving and moving and moving inexorably forward. So Bibi says, I'm going to show them. Time is not on their side. I'm going to build. We have very big bulldozers. They're called D9s. You want to take down the building, we can take down the building. It's a waste of a lot of money, I grant you. But Bibi's point, as I understand it, is not that we want to stick our thumb in the Arab space. Just want to understand time's not on your side. The longer you dilly-dally and the longer you refuse to accept our legitimacy and the longer you refuse to recognize our existence and the longer you refuse to come to the place, we're going to keep building. And some of it you're not going to get back because we're building cities. And we're not going to raze them all, R-A-Z-E them all. We're not going to do it. The only people on the planet, actually, who are communicating to the Palestinians that time is not on their side are the Israelis. And when the Israelis do that, the world sees it as kind of poking their finger in the thumb of the eye. But I think it's actually quite the opposite. I think it's the only people anywhere on the planet that are actually giving the Palestinians an incentive to come to the table. If the rest of the world did exactly the same thing, then I wouldn't be so confident that I would say that nobody here is going to live to see the end of the occupation. And maybe the world will change. Because things are changing rapidly, Brexit and Europe and the United States. I mean, the world is a very rapidly changing place. Maybe I'll be thankfully wrong, and one day we'll get back together here in the same room or at a different place in this community, and we'll say, back in 2016 I said whatever, and I was wrong. I was wrong. I'd be happy to be wrong. But I think the reason that I'm not wrong is because nobody in the international community is giving the Palestinians any incentive to make any accommodation, quite the contrary.
I'm Israeli-American, kibbutznik, Sabra. my parents suffered too. And first of all, I can tell you that the media, that's what they show.
I want to hear a question.
Okay, so you want your kids to love Israel? Send them to Israel, number one.
I agree.
Okay?
Still don't hear the question,
No,
but okay.
just teach them. Send them, make sure they're going there for more than a week. Okay. Now, if you want to see peace, the American not do it. Netanyahu, the way it is, nothing going to happen. Okay?
Is there a question
Israelis,
coming?
yes, it is. Israeli and American, Israeli and Palestinian can make peace if they want it. But American, with the tax money that you give for certain things that do good thing and bad thing, never going to make peace.
Okay, great. Next question.
You don't want to answer.
It's not a question.
Okay.
Can't answer.
But,
Yeah,
comment.
just for a second. First of all, thank you for coming to our community.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I appreciate how you talked clearly about chapter 1.0 about Zionism. And I'm sure in the book it probably touches on the next chapter, which is that you talked about the celebration of reinventing the Jew and being at a place now that we couldn't even imagine existed, not being fearful to walk through the streets. And I think one of the questions young people have today is, number one, there's a lack of that information, or even knowing how epic, how historic that is. But beyond that is, so what's the call today? Once we've reached that call, and Israel's not just an enterprise for Israelis, it's an enterprise for the whole world. Why should I, as a young Jew, once we've attained that, what's left to achieve? What are we yearning for? Why should we be inspired to travel, to make aliyah, et cetera, et cetera? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. It's a wonderful question. I think, first of all, I want to make it clear this was not in any way meant to be a pitch for Aliyah. In fact, I daven 3 times a day with a long list of American Jews that I pray to God will not make Aliyah. It's only partially effective, which is a theological problem for me to work out on my own time. But I really, really, really do not believe that one needs to live in Israel to have a fulfilling Jewish life or to be a contributing member of the Jewish people. For thousands and thousands of years, the center of Jewish life has been in the diaspora. It's still a very important part of the Jewish world. And this is not about suggesting that everybody needs to make Aliyah in any way, shape, manner, or form. Here's what we haven't done yet. Okay? We haven't actually figured out. I'll put out a whole bunch of ideas, some of which you'll appreciate and like more, some of which you'll appreciate and like less, but that's, the nature of the Jewish game. We haven't quite figured out, for example, if a large measure of the Jewish legal tradition, of the halachic tradition, was about trying to keep Jewish identity thriving and pulsing in an area in which we were a small minority, always beset by a kind of a hostile environment, should halakha change in a setting in which we don't face those challenges? Should Jewish law look different in a sovereign state of Israel? Question that a lot of Israelis, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, talk about regularly. I think that's an open question. I think the question of what does it mean to be a Jewish state and a democracy at the same time mean? How do you, we are not America. We are not a Hebrew-speaking, falafel-eating version of the United States. We're not. Because this is a country which is not devoted to the thriving of any particular ethnicity, at least in theory. But I say that 1,000% seriously. And if we were here having this conversation 6 months ago, I would have said that without any hesitation whatsoever. It's a country that's just about liberty and opportunity and freedom and so on and so forth. We are about all of that, but we are about first and fundamentally the thriving of the Jewish people. How do you create a Jewish state which is of the Jews, by the Jews, and for the Jews, to paraphrase Lincoln, in which Israeli Arabs feel 100% part of the fiber and the fabric of that country and devoted to it and so on and so forth? It's a question. We haven't figured that out. 7 times or 17 times, I forget already, the Torah says, Lo toneh et hager ki ger hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. You cannot oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So what do you do with all those people that want to come into your land? It used to be that they were literally coming up from Egypt because they were coming from Ethiopia and the Sudan, and we were letting them in, then we stopped letting them in. Now, by the way, it's not from Egypt, but if you go to the Galilee, to the Golan where I was just a couple of weeks ago, you can literally walk along the border and see the Syrian refugees desperate to come across. It's a heartbreaking thing. Talk to some of my students whose job in the army was actually to decide who got to come across. That's being a judge in a capital case. What are we going to do? How many are we going to let in? How much do you extend and how much do you not extend? And the kids talk about unbelievable things, by the way, about what it's like for Israeli soldiers to cross the border, go into Syria, to pick up somebody who's grievously wounded, but would rather die there than come into Israel because they've heard such horrible things about Israel. But nonetheless, they get brought into Israel to hospitals. They're completely fixed up and brought back. And the word begins to spread in Syria, it's not so terrible. So how do we spread the word about what we're trying to accomplish in the Arab world? There's a lot of issues. Memory. We haven't figured out memory. Without memory, the Jews are done. We are actually in the memory business. Think about it. I mean, half of what we do as Jews is about the memory business. But yet, memory can also ossify you. Memory of the Shoah, memory of the Holocaust can make you perpetually nervous about taking any risk for anything. And that's not a good thing either. Haredim, gays and lesbians. There's no end to the issues that we have to face. I think the question is, now that we've gotten, as you say, to Zionism 1.1 and we can make a check mark, Zionism 1.0, Zionism 2.0 is about how do we move closer to the perfected society that we would like to be, that I think the Torah fundamentally is really fundamentally about. We're never going to get to a perfect society because when you try to figure one thing out, other questions that you could not have imagined pop up. But I would like to create an Israel in which the rank and file person understands that now the fundamental enterprise is not about changing the existential condition of the Jew, but about trying to fashion for the world a model society to which other people could look. By the way, we're a lot closer to that in many ways than people know, but we have a long, long, long way to go. And I'll just end by saying that I think that's our original job. That's what it means to be Abraham. In other words, when the Midrash asks, why is Abraham called a Hebrew? It's not because of the kind of school that he went to, right? Why is he called an Ivri? Says the Midrash, because the whole world was on one bank, one Ever of the river, and he was on the other bank, the other Ever. We were speaking truth to power. That's what the prophets did. The prophets did not tell the future. The prophets spoke truth to power. The prophets spoke about a model society. I would like to get to a place where we are comfortable enough in our own skin and comfortable enough in our own neighborhood that we could then make the creation of the society that I think the Torah has at its core vision a living, thriving, actual reality. And that's where we have to get, and that's where, hopefully over the course of time we'll be able to work towards. I'll take one more.
I saw your hand first. In the back.
Good question. Yeah, it seems so. Can you hear me?
No.
Check.
Sure. Just say it loud and I'll repeat it.
Oh, just a quick question. You said that we won't see peace with the Palestinians. Do you think we'll get a positive vote from India or China before or after we make peace with the Palestinians? I'm talking about the United Nations.
Yeah, look,
They're friends.
there's a fascinating conversation going on right now in Mosaic Magazine online. Those of you that don't look at Mosaic Magazine should. First of all, it's really high-level stuff. Second of all, you can get a little email reminder telling you that there's new articles out. It doesn't cost anything. Mosaic Mag, I think it is .com or mosaicmagazine.com. And then what they do typically is they put out an article, and then over the course of the coming weeks, there's kind of serious responses, not, talkbacks, but other articles that are responses to the article. And I think the most current one actually is, when the world looks like it's moving closer and closer to Israel, is it really moving closer and closer to Israel? And the article that came out yesterday and today was saying basically right now, China and India look like they're closing up. But I really only skimmed it. But they were arguing basically that that's a short-term thing. At the end of the day, look, countries are utilitarian entities. Countries are self-serving entities, including Israel, including the United States, including India, including China. They will do at the end of the day what is good for them. And so I think, to know where Israel's going to end up in that very complex set of variables is really very, very, very hard to know. We don't know where the hell Putin is going. No, I mean that really very seriously. We don't know what his designs are. We know what he'll do in a power vacuum so far. We don't know if that power vacuum is going to change. Because on one hand, we're hearing a lot of a lot of claim that we're going to stop America's enemies from encroaching. On the other hand, we're hearing a lot of claim about an isolationist worldview. We don't know which one it's going to be. It's way too early to tell. We don't know which way Israeli politics are going to go. We don't know what's going to happen in China and so on and so forth. So I think the only honest answer, and it's also not my real area of expertise, but I would say that at this point, I think it would be very, very, very hard to know. I think it's The Atlantic, if I'm not mistaken. The current issue of The Atlantic is an interview with Henry Kissinger about how to avoid war with China. And I think, by the way, that whether China is friendly to Israel is a critically important question, but an even more important question is how to avoid war with China. I haven't read the article yet, I just saw the cover, but it looks like it's worth a quick read. One last question.
I have one more person because I caught his eye. You want to ask another question? Can you speak loud enough?
My name is Alex Verkowski, and I am from Israel. And I just wanted to ask you, in your vision, how do you square the fact that Israel is becoming a very corrupt country, especially with politicians?
Yeah, okay. Israel, there's nothing to be proud about that Israel has a former president in jail serving a sentence for rape. There's nothing to be proud about that. And there's nothing to be proud about the fact that Israel has a lot of public officials who are either being indicted or being accused or going to jail or in jail. The corruption is a huge issue, and you're 1,000% right to point to it. There's nothing good to say about that, except for the fact that we're still a country which investigates, prosecutes, and convicts. At the point that that stops, we're in very, very, very big trouble. I think the question, by the way, of why this has been allowed to happen goes back to the question that the gentleman in the back row asked. You know, you want to ask whether I love Bibi Netanyahu or don't love Bibi Netanyahu is really completely irrelevant. But here's what I will say is my main gripe about Bibi. And it's got nothing to do with Palestinians. It's got nothing to do with the joint session of Congress. It's got nothing to do with Barack Obama. It's got nothing to do with Sarah collecting bottles and returning them for the refunds. Got to make a living. Here's my problem. Bibi's been prime minister in 2 years. He'll have been prime minister longer than anybody else in the history of the state. More than Ben Gurion, more than anybody else. You tell me the time that you heard from Bibi Netanyahu a vision for Israeli society about what should be. That's what Israelis need to elect. They don't need a general. They don't need the smartest guy in town. They don't need a guy or a woman with mellifluous English. We need to start electing people who actually can infuse Israeli society once again with a profound vision for what it is that we're trying to create, which is what we're talking about in the formal part of the presentation, what the answer to this gentleman in the back was all about. And I'll just end therefore with the following sentence. The book is written in English, designed for an American audience, trying to answer the questions that young Americans have, that older Americans have, that Jewish Americans have, that Gentile Americans would have, that evangelicals will have, that mainstream Protestants will have. It's a book that tries to, that people that know a lot about Israel might still have, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody once said to me, we're going to translate it into Hebrew. I don't know, yes or no, but it's not a matter of taking the file, handling it to a translator and say translate. The book has to be kind of recrafted. But the questions that are in the book need to be raised for Israelis also. We're in a position of, by the way, America's learning it this week also. Revolutions need to be refueled periodically, and people need to be reminded about the cores of what the revolutions were about the moral impulse, the freedom impulse, the liberty impulse, the egalitarian impulse in the case of the United States, and the Jewish impulse and the decency impulse and so forth in the case of Israel. I think we've gone far too long, largely because the conflict clouds everything all day long. I think Israel needs leaders who are going to raise this kind of a conversation for Israeli Jews as well. Who those people are, whether they're coming up the pike or not, that's a whole other kind of conversation, which we can have at a different time. But I'll simply end by once again thanking you very much for having me back after such a short period of time. It's a great honor. Thank you very, very much.